get started. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure when it's right at noon. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar on election law and how an MSL in government law and policy can help advance your career. So today our guest speaker is Professor Rebecca Olson, where I'm going to give it to her in a few minutes. After she makes her remarks, I'll talk about the MSL program, what makes our program distinctive, the next steps, and obviously, we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So Professor Rebecca Olson is during the daytime and probably in many evenings nowadays, a full-time attorney. And she's a founding partner of Miller Olson. I'm sorry, I'm reading your bio because there's so much I could not, So you specialize, in short, you specialize in political, campaign, election, and nonprofit law. And so obviously now being the height of the season for election law here in California, you must be very busy. So thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to turn this over to you now, and I'll let you make your remarks. You teach election law for us, and it's one of the elective course in the Master of Science in Law and Government Law and Policy.
Yes. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Hope we get some folks that are interested in election law. And I always get the speaking request now because it's all in the news and it's when I am very busy, but it's all fun. I'm glad that it's of interest, especially now. For many years, we were kind of this niche practice that people didn't understand. And now that it's become much more in the forefront, it's nice to have a lot more people who are interested in the area. Like the dean said, I'm an attorney at Miller & Olson. We started that firm about 11 years ago. So we do we practice all kinds of law that relate to elections, politics, and government ethics, along with nonprofit law. And a lot of times all of those things overlap in different ways. And that's what keeps it interesting for me. For us, there's, clients are candidates, political action committees, lobbyists, lobbying firms, elected officials, ballot measure committees, nonprofit organizations. And we advise on state, local, and federal law with some other state laws as well, which keeps it extremely interesting. And I think it really is nice now that we dovetail into the election law course itself. We get to address things like voting rights, redistricting and representation, gerrymandering, election administration, ballot propositions, especially here in California. That's a big deal in a lot of the Western states. Campaigns, campaign finance, and political parties. So I think the course is nice in that way, where you get a little taste of the different areas that all exist in election law. And I know there's kind of a companion course that deals on the lobbying side. So we don't delve as much into that. But as part of the governmental law and policy division, I think that'd be a great course to take as well. I think that much of election law comes from constitutional law, at least the basis for it. So we're talking about First Amendment political speech and voting rights and how that is in the Constitution. We talk a lot about how it got there, why it got there, the amendments that apply. So it helps provide kind of a broad perspective of where election law comes from, and then how it filters down into campaign finance rules, other regulations put out by ethics commissions. And so I think it helps kind of have that broad overview of where it all fits. And that I think can help advance careers in a number of different ways. And I think having that basis, it can be really helpful when you're thinking about or already participating in a field where either election law or a companion kind of subject comes into play. So for me, prior to going to law school, I worked in campaign finance compliance. So I kind of feel like I have a soft spot too for folks who don't want to go the whole JD route, who do want to advance their career in a way, not just learning on the job, but also getting a degree that can assist, can advance your career, can allow you to have either, move up or allow you to have kind of more insight into the reasons that things are happening in your workplace. And so for me, I think I've got a staff in my law firm, for instance, that are non-lawyers, that we rely on heavily to do all kinds of great things. In our campaign finance practice, it requires us managing folks, the committees and clients' bank accounts, filing the campaign finance reports or lobbying reports with governmental agencies. I think what's interesting is that it's very particular, that it falls into the area of law, but there are many jobs in assisting lawyers and assisting clients where you don't need a JD. You don't have to go there practice law, but can be heavily involved and heavily necessary. The staff at my firm is invaluable. So that's kind of specific to my practice in terms of how it can advance your career. But I think there's all kinds of different ways that it really can do that. I think it, not only in a field of election law, but like private practice or the campaign finance compliance that I was mentioning before, you can also be on the regulatory side. So if we're talking about specifically to election law, the Fair Political Practices Commission, local agency, there are local ethics agencies. San Francisco has an ethics agency, Oakland, Los Angeles, San Diego. They all have ethics agencies that assist or regulate the folks involved in elections and governmental ethics. So that can also be another way to go. On the state level, it's the Fair Political Practices Commission. They have quite the job because there's a significant amount of people in California who fall under the umbrella of the Political Reform Act that they are responsible for regulating and educating people about. So not just enforcement actions, but they have a section where they write regulations and the commission passes them. They have a whole department on education. They help people be able to comply who are running for local office or decided to get a political action committee or are doing lobbying for a nonprofit, that sort of thing. They have an entire education department that assists with ensuring people are in compliance and, which is the best as opposed to having to just get in trouble. They assist people in learning more about it. So that's an option as well. A local ethics commissions, like we said, registrars of voters in California are responsible for regulating elections, administering elections. So every county has one. City clerks in municipalities also have election responsibilities. Usually they work in conjunction with the registrars. But they have their own, city council races and things that they're responsible in terms of administering those elections as well. I think if you go a little more broadly, can also assist in learning more about drafting statutes and regulations in these areas in election law, campaign finance, lobbying, ethics, understanding what can be regulated, what cannot be regulated based on the Constitution, based on case law that we study in the course, allows, you, if you're assisting a member of the legislature or in drafting regulations, to understand, what can be regulated, what can't be regulated, where that line might be, so that you could assist in that sense in election law. I have had some colleagues who work in the, legislative counsel's office, and they'll have staff that are like, here's my bill. And, the lawyers and staff go, that's not going to happen because that'd be unconstitutional, immediately. Or if you have staff that has this background, MSL from McGeorge taking some sort of election law class, you can raise your hand to the staff, your fellow coworkers, and say, I think that might be a problem based on recent case law and that sort of thing. So I think, that also the regulatory context, even as we talked about before with city council, in California, local cities and local jurisdictions can pass their own campaign finance rules, their own ethics rules. So assisting a city council or a city clerk in understanding what the possible rules could be, what other cities do, and how that all fits into the larger election law context, I think can be really helpful. I can't tell you the number of city officials or small jurisdictions where we've, based on the state law, we're required to file something with them. And they'll say, you know, this is what you need to do. And I say, no, that's not the law. You know, and so a lot of city officials, especially I feel badly for city clerks in those smaller jurisdictions where, you know, they have so many different jobs. And election law is not their number one priority, but it comes around every 2 years or 4 years, depending on their city council jurisdiction or local ballot measures. And they're having to kind of scramble to learn as they go. You know, the Political Reform Act in California that regulates these, you know, campaign finance rules and where you file, basically say, okay, well, if you're doing this activity, file with the city clerk. The city clerk may have no idea, you know, that they're responsible for doing that or what it should look like. So I think with having just some background, you know, with an MSL would be, you know, extremely helpful, you know, in that context where the election law portion may not be the main job, but it's really important. And especially as we've seen kind of attacks on election administration officials, having, you know, folks there who know what the rules are and are less likely to be intimidated, understand what their job is, what they're allowed to do and not do, what voters can do, what election watchers can do, all of those sorts of things become extremely important, I think. You know, it just will continue to grow in importance, and it's important that we have well-trained folks who want to do this kind of work. I think also away from the governmental side, you also have, you know, governmental affairs departments. So for all kinds of companies, businesses who need to have an active presence in the Capitol here in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C. I think jobs can be extremely important in there. Help your state or local agency if you want to work, you know, in state government in Sacramento. They have ethics requirements. You know, state employees have ethics requirements. Financial disclosures requires a lot of administration, and people have a lot of questions about how it applies to them. So I think, and restrictions in terms of what government employees, you know, either political employees or your rank and file state worker can and can't do as governmental employees. So that's interesting as well, I think. And then in a nonprofit context, voting rights nonprofit organizations that do some sort of lobbying, voter registration is really important. We've seen kind of a change in that area because, you know, in California, at least everyone is automatically registered now. So that has turned to switch to get out the vote efforts, encourage people to make sure they're returning their ballots or understand how to do it and how to return it. And a lot of nonprofits take a lead in that. And that can be really important work. I think we also work with other nonprofit organizations that grant funds to nonprofits. Well, sometimes those funds that are being granted for political purposes or campaign related work or ballot measure work. And so having some knowledge about how that works could be extremely beneficial in the nonprofit context as well. And then, you know, your basic, you volunteer or work for a campaign, ballot measure committee, you know, doing compliance or fundraising, or even campaigning. I can tell you, working with folks who have a base of knowledge of what the rules are, it makes it the campaign go much more smoothly for their candidate or their ballot measure that they're looking to pass. You know, you know, my first job out of college was working for a candidate as well, and I got to learn the fundraising side, and then work with the compliance council to ensure that, you know, we were providing everything they needed to ensure that the campaign was in compliance. So I think in that sense that, you know, election law can be really, I'm election law nerd, so I love it. I think it can be really interesting. I think it's constantly changing. Especially campaign finance rules in California. their legislation is constantly being passed. New regulations are being, passed as well. It keeps me busy as a lawyer, but it also means that having people who have that basis of knowledge and understanding are in demand. For people who don't keep their pulse on this, it's not particularly a difficult area of the law to learn, but it's very specific. And so if you're not heavily involved in it regularly, or don't have that basis, like with an MSL, it can be overwhelming. You think, well, I'll never understand that. Well, if you've got the basis, you may be able to help, kind of explain where it comes from, what it's meant to do, the new changes in the law we've seen. We used to say the election law didn't change very much in terms of federal case law or Supreme Court cases. There were just a few until recently. And so the whole landscape has changed. And so having a good handle on it with taking election law or being in the governmental law and policy center, I think you really get to keep your finger on the pulse there. I had someone who said to me the other day, an associate of a client, well, I've been doing this for 30 years and that's not ever how it's been. And I was like, well, that's true because it changed. And that's, having that handle and that broad understanding where it comes from. It's not just because this is the way it's always been, but that you have a handle on what, where that law comes from, what the basis is, and how it can change, and how it has changed recently can make you extremely helpful, I think, in any career, and advance your career where you may already be as well, understanding how regulations work, how statutes work, how they interact with each other, and how it comes from case law in general, I think could be extremely valuable. But I also feel like I could talk forever on this. I don't want anyone to fall asleep. So let me know if we want to move to a Q&A or if there's anything else I can address before we do that.
Thank you. Why don't I just go over what the MSL program in government law and policy, what are the courses, what does a degree program entail, and then I'll open it up for Q&A if that works for you, Rebecca.
That's
okay.
Perfect.
Realize I didn't share my screen, so you didn't see my beautiful PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. Now you can. So here we go. So I think I'm just going to quickly very much go through this. I think Professor Olson has talked about what the MSL in government law and policy is, like in many different ways, and who could benefit from it. I just want to stress that when we decided to move this concentration online, we did that prior to COVID, but we also did that because we have a very strong JD program in government law and policy. We call that the capital lowering program. And so that's why this MSL just came very naturally. Professor Olson?
Yeah.
I said that you unmuted yourself. Oh, I didn't know if you wanted to say something.
Oh, no, just in case you had a question. No, I'm good.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So the program is fully online. However, it's very interactive, as Professor Olson will attest. Like there is weekly interaction between the professor and the students, and also among the students. And it's done in an asynchronous manner. So students have the opportunity to do the work at a time that is convenient for them, but yet there's still weekly deadline to help you, make good progress in your course. And there are also, depending on the professor, some optional Zoom in office hours or Zoom in sessions, synchronous sessions. So the program is 26 units. It can be done in 1 year, but really the program was designed to be done in 2 or 3 years, part-time. Students often take 1 or 2 courses at a time. As you can see, you have half of the units as required courses and the other half are electives. Because there's a lot of overlap with our water and environmental law concentration, my apologies. Our students are able to take water and environmental law related courses. Students also have the options to do a capstone, we call that a directed research, or to write a thesis on a particular topic of law. We then match you with a professor who has that expertise. we didn't make that a requirement because we realized that this is very much a degree for that we want to teach practical skills. So thesis does not always necessarily work unless someone has something very particular in mind. So we'll leave this as an option. Because of timing, I think I'm just again very quickly going to talk about another course that we offer in the program. Is one of our government law and policy required courses. It's the government law and policy making course that does, as you can see, students get to learn the theory, but also they get to do analysis of policies. They get to weigh the pros and cons of various venues and processes. They get to practice their skills on public policy matters, because even though it's a law program, it's a legal degree, public policy always influence the law. So how do you take that into consideration? What is the place for public policy? How does that work with the legal and regulatory framework? And so, and the project, the final paper in this class is actually a project on a current policy, public policy problem that the students choose. So for those of you who are interested in getting to know a little bit more about our online programs, I see that we have actually a current student in the webinar. So hopefully she will be able to weigh in if we have any questions about how does it work, how the coursework works. But our program is all of our courses are asynchronous. I already mentioned interactive with a weekly discussion. There's plenty of opportunity to create a collegial online learning environment. And as I mentioned, we focus on the legal theory, but also on practical real world assignments. We take students, admit students in the fall and then the spring. Our next cohort is going to start on January 9th. Our application deadline is coming up. I should tell you that it's very much it's a priority application deadline. After that, we're going to still accept application, but it may take a little longer for us to review your application. So with this in mind, this is the end of my formal remarks. And so I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I know this is the most important part of the webinar. And I am going to encourage you to post them either in the chat or in the Q&A box in Zoom. So I'm going to open my two and I will read out loud the questions. So we can wait a couple minutes for our audience to type their questions. So while we're waiting, by curiosity, is there one issue, one topic that is most often litigated in election law, or is it all over the place?
Yeah, it really is all over the place. I think it depends on the time. You know, the time in history we talk about, or recently. Mm-hmm. So, you know, recently by far, it's voting rights for sure, mm-hmm. and access to the ballot. But we saw some, you know, back in the mid 70s when after the Watergate scandal with President mm-hmm. Nixon, that's when we saw all the campaign finance, you know, cases and regulations, and it's when the Political Reform Act started in California. And so like in that time, we'll see that. And obviously then going back farther, you're really seeing a different set of voting rights cases. You know, I think that's probably the one with the most activity, I would say. But it really does depend. And then we went, like I was saying, that long stretch with almost none. So it's very interesting, keeps you on your toes for sure.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question. Are you finding other recognized MSL degrees outside of Sacramento or Northern California? When I work with other lawyers, they don't seem to understand the value as much as I had hoped. So do you obviously work with a lot of lawyers? Thoughts?
Yes, but lawyers are terrible. let's start with that. Okay. We only know what we know. We got a JD. It was really hard. Everyone who follows behind us needs to go through that trauma. They need to take a 3-day or 2-day bar exam in order to really understand. It couldn't be farther from the truth. Well, the MSL program, I think probably in election law and it's relatively new. So I could see like not having experience with MSL students, but I could tell you the difference between having someone who didn't have the background in it and having an MSL who was in the government law, policy program, it would be night and day for me. That would be something that I, think, is awesome. But I would say, you stick with it. You let them know it's being taught in McGeorge. I graduated from McGeorge, right? So you know that it's high quality. You know that you're getting a really good education. It just takes lawyers a very long time to come around to new ideas, especially private practice. This is the way I've always done it. And so, anything new is different, scary, or it doesn't make any sense. They'll come around. They'll understand the value, especially when you show, what you've brought and what you've learned to what you're doing. And there are all kinds of positions that don't require law degrees. So the difference between having someone with just an undergrad degree or having someone with MSL, is of great value. So I could see how that would happen, but I wouldn't let it discourage you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the MSL degree, it's something that is, this type of degree is taught in nearly all the states in the United States. But as Professor Olson mentioned, it's a fairly new degree. And it does not have a uniform name. So we call it a Master of Science in Law. Some other schools may call it a Master of Jurisprudence. Others may call it a Master in Legal Skills. So that's unfortunate for the degree that there are so many different acronyms. I think the people that work with non-lawyers value and can understand and value what the program is and the strengths of that program. But I think, as Professor Olson mentioned, lawyers are very resistant to changes, and not everyone is in favor, of such degree. The same way that the California bar went from 3 days to 2 days 2 years ago, and if you knew the amount of discussion that there were among lawyers suggesting that if new lawyers only take a 2-day bar, they're not going to be as qualified as someone who's taking a 3-day bar. It's to me, it just does not. There is no basis for it. But I think it just reflects how what Professor Olson was mentioning.
It's funny with that too. We all know, and all of us lawyers know, that the bar exam is not a good measure of whether you'll be a very good attorney. It's whether you can test well, whether you remembered a lot of knowledge and can apply it. I do not, it was not easy. I do not disparage anyone, taking the bar exam, because it's very difficult, and, requires a lot of skill, but it doesn't necessarily translate to being a good lawyer. So the fact that it went from 3 to 2 is really, I feel like, an argument of, it was hard for me, it should be hard for you too. But really the question should be, is it better? And, why is it better? And so I think that, we are very resistant to change, but I think it'll come around. And I think there's a very specific way that when you're in a JD program, you're taught to think. And that takes, it takes a long time to be able to think like a lawyer. And so a lot of times, with staff, non-lawyer staff, we want to say, oh, well, it should be this way, and this way, because we've been trained to think that way. But to go from someone who hasn't had kind of any exposure in terms of their degrees to someone who has a MSL, where they've studied the area that we're now working in, to say that isn't a positive seems just silly to me. It definitely would be.
Thank you. Any other questions? And Elizabeth, it's very nice to have you here, and I'm glad you're enjoying the program. Yeah,
don't get discouraged by by lawyers outside, though. You'll find the right one.
Any other
More
questions?
people to be election law nerds yet. We haven't gotten the word out yet. I'm sure we will.
I don't see any additional questions, and I hate to waste anybody's time, and I know how busy you are, Professor Olson, right now. So I think unless I see another questions from our audience, I think this marks the end of our presentation. Let me just double check. Yes, so feel free, anyone, to reach out to us. You see, there's my email address. There is my department's email address. Please do email us. And if you have any questions directly for Professor Olson, I'll be more than happy to forward them to her. So she teaches this in the spring, election law in the spring, because as you can imagine, the fall is not a good time. So we very much appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much.